Welcome to our third part in the series of Two Kings, focusing on King Herod and King Jesus. Today, we're going to be focusing on the aspect of religion. What was the attitude of these two leaders concerning religion? We've been looking at the lives of King Herod and King Jesus, their character, and their leadership. And we've seen that King Herod relied on his own ingenuity. He was a skillful engineer, had many building projects, was very adept in political affairs, and he often used politics to his own advantage, using the powerful people in Rome to get him what he wanted. And we'll see today that he used religion to advance his career. Whereas Jesus, on the other hand, relied on his Father's will. Instead of playing politics, he taught and lived the truth. And lastly, in terms of religion, his teachings and his convictions often got the religious authorities upset because they disagreed with their teachings. And so Jesus was not afraid to tell God's truth in a straightforward manner, and this often upset the religious authorities of the day. Last time we took a look at a place, Caesarea, the port city of Caesarea, and Herod took that very common place that really wasn't naturally endowed to be a harbor. He built a breakwater using cement that cures underwater. He had a hippodrome there, he had a theater, he had palaces. It was definitely a first-class, luxurious city so that he could entertain Caesar. And he even built a temple to Caesar to try to honor and show his allegiance to Caesar. Matthew 2:8 says, "And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, 'Go and search carefully for the child, and when you have found him, report to me, so that I too may come and worship him.'" These were the words of Herod the Great to the wise men. Now, did Herod really want to come and worship Jesus? No, he wanted to kill him. So this is Herod's attitude towards religion. He had a very twisted attitude towards it, a very unscrupulous man, and simply using religious language to get what he wanted. And so we see Herod's true intentions as later he kills the infants, baby boys 2 years and younger, at Bethlehem. Jesus, on the other hand, we see in his encounter with the woman at the well in John chapter 4, Jesus said to that woman, "Woman, believe me, an hour is coming when neither in this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father." John 14:21. So Jesus was saying that there's going to be a day where the temple's not going to matter anymore. True worship will be to the Father through him. Well, let's look at the Temple Mount area. The temple area was at the peak of Mount Moriah, okay? And of course, being a hill, there's slopes on the various sides, and so this couldn't accommodate the large crowds that would gather there for the 3 annual feasts for the Jews. So what Herod did is he took that area, flattened it out by building huge retaining walls and then filling in the inside of those walls with earth to make a nice flat level platform for people to gather. So we call that structure, the walls and the interior flat area, as the Temple Mount today. And in this diagram of Jerusalem in Jesus' day, we can see in purple the outline of the walls that Herod built for the Temple Mount area. And so there in the center we see the temple. So that was on top of Mount Moriah. The temple stood basically on the top of Mount Moriah, and of course the natural topography sloped off from there. So Herod built those walls and filled in the interior with earth. Here's a close-up view of the Temple Mount area, here depicted in orange with the Hekal or temple in the center, and we can see those walls that Herod built there. Here's a model of Jerusalem in the time of Jesus. We're looking due west. In the foreground of our slide would have been the Kidron Valley, fairly deep, and then moving up to the eastern wall. The temple faced east, and so we can see the front of the temple. We're kind of on the perspective coming from the Mount of Olives, looking across the Kidron Valley at the Temple Mount area. And I want you to see how flat inside that box, inside that Temple Mount area, the structure is, so the crowds could gather there. Here's another view of the Temple Mount area. This time we're looking northeast, so we see the southwestern corner in the foreground of our slide, and there's the Central Valley in front of the western wall there, and there were a couple of stairways and entryways going into the temple area on the western side. But we can see how the temple backed up to the western wall. I'm going to show you a few aerial slides of the Temple Mount so you can get a perspective of the walls and how they're visible even to this day. So we're looking due north in this slide. In the center we can see the Dome of the Rock, that golden dome structure. And whenever you see that structure, think that's where the temple originally stood. And just to the south of that is the silver-domed El Aqsa Mosque there in the Temple Mount area. So we can easily see the walls that are outlining the Temple Mount area. In this slide, we're looking northwest, but again, we can easily see the Dome of the Rock, the El Aqsa Mosque, and the walls surrounding those structures. Now, the wall that's coming out from the El Aqsa Mosque to the south and then turning abruptly 90-degree angle towards the west was a wall that was added later. So that's not part of the original Temple Mount structure. The stones that Herod had carved had a very distinct margin around them. We call this a Herodian margin, and that makes the Herodian stones very identifiable today. These stones were so perfectly carved that they did not need any cement to connect them together. It was the sheer weight of the stones that held them in place. Now, of course, 2,000 years of erosion from rain and whatnot has exposed some cracks and whatnot in the stones, but originally you couldn't fit even a sheet of paper in between these stones. Well, we're looking at the Temple Mount area from the Mount of Olives, so we're looking west across the Kidron Valley to the Temple Mount area. You can see the Dome of the Rock there on the right, the El Aqsa Mosque on the left, and below the El Aqsa Mosque you can see the southeastern corner of the Temple Mount walls, and you can see how high that is. And I want you to notice how flat the interior area is. So let's zoom in a little bit, same angle. We can see how high the walls are there. We can even see people walking around in the interior of the Temple Mount area, and you can see how high they are compared with the natural ground level, some 64 meters below them. So this is the highest point of the top of the wall to the natural base of the land, some 64 meters. And so this is your professor many years ago standing at the southeastern corner of the Temple Mount walls, with these walls towering above me. Well, Herod added onto some already existing walls that were around the Temple Mount area, and we can easily see this in the area called the seam. And so to the right of the seam in our slide here are stones that are kind of bulging out, and then to the left are the flat, smooth stones of Herod. And so the stones to the right are of earlier origin, and then Herod extended the Temple Mount area to the south. So here we can see the seam, obviously two different construction techniques, and they weren't meant to match up. So the Herodian stones being on the left. So Herod extended the part to the left or to the south. Herod used a very important engineering technique of laying the stones down in a header and stretcher fashion. And the reason why he did this is because with all that earth inside the walls, there was tremendous pressure to push those stones outward. And so in order to keep the stones in place, he would alternate having one lengthwise and then having the other at right angles going into the Temple Mount structure. So notice the white stone at the top. Okay, see how long it is? All right, that's an example of a stretcher. That is, the part that we see from the outside is very long. Now a header, you see just the head of the stone, but the great length of the stone is going into the center of the Temple Mount structure, and so that stone is embedded deep in the earth that's behind it. So this technique of alternating the stones instead of just having them on the edge really strengthened the walls of the Temple Mount, and that's why 2,000 years later they're still in place. Here's a photo of what it actually looks like. We can see in the top arrow just a square-shaped box of the head of the stone. That's a header. But that stone is going very deep into the inside of the Temple Mount structure. Now another stone down a few rows where it says one stone, that's the same size stone, just turned 90 degrees. And so now we see the stretcher, the long side of that stone. So these were put there in alternating fashion to keep those stones in place. Also, there were some large stones used in the master course. This is in the southern portion of the walls of Herod's Temple Mount structure. You can see these stones were higher than a person. But we're going to go see some of the largest stones in the Temple Mount walls. Now, in a typical tour to Israel, most people don't get to see these stones, but you're going to get to see them. If you go to Israel, you'd have to ask for a special permission to go on the rabbinic tunnel tour. And so we're going to go inside that arch on the left-hand side of our picture. We're here at the Wailing Wall, or Western Wall. And so we're going to go inside that arch, and there we will see Wilson's Arch. That was the man who discovered this. And that was part of a arch that supported a walkway from the Western Hill to the Temple Mount area that the priests would use in order to have direct access to the temple and not possibly be defiled by any commoner or unclean person along the way. So this arch supported that walkway. So inside that area of Wilson's Arch is the rabbinic tunnel. And there they found some of the largest ashlars in the Western Wall. And these are so large, couldn't even fit them in the picture. There's just not enough room to back up and get a good picture. But you can see they have the traditional Herodian margin around them. And in this picture, we see This is probably the largest stone in the walls of the Temple Mount. It would have weighed 375 metric tons. That's kind of hard to imagine. So think of it this way, as 34 fully loaded 10-wheeler trucks. Can you imagine 34 fully loaded trucks? Well, that's the weight of this stone. How they were able to move stones of this size and weight, engineers today still don't really understand. This stone was over 12 meters long. Well, the Jews gather at the Western Wall today for prayers, for worship, and sometimes for religious ceremonies, because that was the wall closest to the temple itself. Here in this model of Jerusalem, we can see where the Wailing Wall is located on the left-hand portion of our slide, and then the temple, where the backside is rather close to the Wailing Wall or Western Wall. Now, it's close, but it's not exactly right next to it. We see the Dome of the Rock there, and that's where the temple would have stood and where the Wailing Wall is located. But because there's existing structures to the north of the Wailing Wall, the Jews can't gather there. So the closest place they can gather and not enter into the Temple Mount structure would be the Wailing Wall. And that's why it's a popular place for the Jews to gather and worship today. And so often they will go there to pray, because they feel that prayers offered at the Wailing Wall are more effective than prayers in other places. And so they will write out their prayers oftentimes on slips of paper and then put them in the cracks in the wall. And you can see some of those prayer requests wadded up and put into the cracks in the stones. Now today, if you can't make it down to the Wailing Wall to offer up your prayers, you can use your cell phone, call your favorite rabbi who's down at the Western Wall, and you can call in your prayer requests and he can pray them for you at the Wailing Wall. Sometimes the Jews have religious ceremonies there at the Western Wall, like a bar mitzvah ceremony, where a young boy, 13 years of age, is now old enough to be required to keep the Jewish law. Bar mitzvah means son of the commandments, so he's now required to keep the commandments. And here we see probably a father having his hands on his son there, giving him a blessing in the bar mitzvah ceremony. And sometimes the Jews gather there, they hold up the Torah scrolls as part of their worship. This man is wearing what we call a phylactery. That is a small box containing a small portion of scripture in there. And this comes from Deuteronomy, where God says that you shall take his word and bind them on your foreheads and on your forearms. And so some of the Jews take that command very literally, and they literally bind that scripture on their foreheads, and those strips of leather around their arm signify their obedience to that command in the book of Deuteronomy. Again, we can see here where the Wailing Wall is in relation to the Dome of the Rock, which is where the temple would have stood. Now, the Jews, in general, will gather at the Wailing Wall because they don't want to go inside the Temple Mount area and possibly accidentally enter into the place where the Holy of Holies used to be. Now, because the interior of the Temple Mount area is controlled by the Arab Muslims today, They won't allow any archaeological digging, so we don't have any conclusive proof as to where the temple actually stood, because they haven't been allowed to dig there. But we know from various other sources where it was most likely located. So the chief rabbinic of Israel has posted a sign as in the entryway to the Temple Mount area, warning people not to enter that area. And religious Jews will not go into that area for fear they may accidentally enter into the Holy of Holies area. Here we are at the southwest corner of the Temple Mount area, and this is where the trumpet would have been blown for signifying the beginning and ending of the Sabbath. And so a priest would stand up there at the topmost part of this corner of the wall. We know that this happened at this location because a stone that was inscribed was found there, and on that stone, written in Hebrew, is "to the place of trumpeting." And so in this artist depiction, we have the man blowing the trumpet or the shofar, and we see the inscription down below, and we see that was inscribed just where he's standing. And so this is where the priest would blow the shofar. And here's a depiction of a man blowing the ram's horn or shofar.